Opening the king's diagonal grants immediate central influence and prepares rapid piece development. Replicating the central pawn presence immediately creates a balanced struggle for key squares. Developing the knight prepares for castling and immediately contests central pawn control. Developing the knight to guard the central pawn and prepare for further piece play is a principled response, opening many common and solid continuations. Developing the bishop to this active square immediately aims at the opponent's king's weak f7 pawn, setting up potential threats and controlling key diagonals. Developing the bishop to c5 directly challenges the f2 square and prepares for a swift castling, creating a solid foundation for future attacks. Securing the king's safety is paramount, clearing the back rank for potential action. Challenging white's central pawn advance, this knight repositions aggressively, eyeing the king's flank and creating dynamic imbalances. Solidifying the center, this quiet maneuver prepares for a subtle pawn advance or to defend the king, while still allowing development. Solidifying the pawn chain prepares for piece development and contest in the center. Solidifying the central pawn chain, c3 prepares for a potential d4 advance, aiming to wrest control of the center and create a strong pawn triangle, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen or bishop. Creating a potential pawn weakness around the king, black subtly probes for weaknesses while sacrificing valuable tempo that could be used to develop other pieces or challenge white's central pawn structure. Awaiting castling, the rook assumes a preparatory stance, eyeing the central files and subtly hinting at a potential kingside assault or a swift regrouping to bolster the center. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield, black prioritizes king safety, a prudent choice given white's recent rook placement which hints at future central pressure. But this maneuver also subtly prepares for potential pawn advances later, solidifying the kingside. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate g4 advances and aims to maintain a comfortable, closed position for white. Probing for queenside space, black's pawn advance initiates a slow expansion that could prove double-edged. If white can exploit the weakened light squares on the kingside, this aggressive pawn push might backfire, leaving the monarch exposed. Developing the knight to d2 prepares a central pawn push, potentially d4, and also opens a diagonal for the queen. Consider the potential for this knight to become an outpost on f5 or e4, particularly if black's defensive structure weakens. This also provides a flexible retreat square for the knight should it become overextended. Reasserting its influence on the queenside diagonal, the bishop occupies a potentially dynamic square, eyeing white's kingside setup and preparing for future skirmishes that could unravel the pawn structure. Retreating the bishop to b3 subtly prepares for a potential kingside attack by freeing the d-file for the queen, while also keeping a watchful eye on the vulnerable f7 square. It's a patient maneuver that prioritizes piece harmony over immediate confrontation. Developing the bishop to a more active square, it prepares to challenge white's control of the center and potentially unleash an attack on the queenside. Pulling the bishop back to a4 opens up the e1-a4 diagonal, potentially threatening black's kingside development or creating pressure along that line if black isn't careful. Challenging white's queen's bishop placement and aiming to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially a central outpost or supporting a queenside pawn advance. Repositioning the knight to f1 is a strategic retreat, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps g3 or h2, to support a kingside advance or bolster defense. This maneuver frees up the e-file, allowing the rook greater influence, and avoids the potential pin along the c3-f6 diagonal that the knight might face on f3. It also prepares for a potential pawn push like g4 later on, creating attacking chances. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, f5 aims to disrupt white's well-entrenched central pawn structure and pry open the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses around the white king and asserting greater influence in the center. Liberating the e-file offers a sudden pathway for the rook, potentially disrupting black's carefully constructed pawn structure and challenging the open lines that might otherwise favor their knights. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop ignites the center, challenging white's d3 pawn and opening lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on f8, hinting at future queenside pressure. Cracking open the center with d4 is a bold attempt to shatter black's compact pawn structure and liberate white's pieces, though it sacrifices some central control temporarily. Releasing the central tension with this capture immediately opens lines, creating a dynamic battlefield and forcing white to consider the positional implications of their pawn structure. Opening the c-file now forces black to confront the immediate pressure on their central pawn structure, a crucial turning point where calculating exchanges becomes paramount. Reasserting central influence becomes paramount as black repositions their knight, aiming to contest the d4 square and prevent white from fully dominating the center. This maneuver also prepares for potential queenside expansion, offering a dynamic counterpoint to white's seemingly solid pawn structure. The knight's redeployment to the kingside looks for opportunities to apply pressure along the g-file, potentially aiming for a future g4 advance or simply bolstering the kingside presence. Instead of a direct assault, white is initiating a subtle positional shift, rerouting their knight to a more active square where it can influence the center and potentially threaten the black king's sanctuary. This maneuver initiates a rethinking of white's central control and kingside structure, hinting at a longer-term plan rather than an immediate tactical blow. The repositioning of the knight suggests white is reassessing the immediate tactical landscape, seeking to improve the coordination of their pieces for a more strategic engagement. Observe how the knight now supports a potential advance of the h-pawn, creating potential attacking lines, or simply improving the defensive setup around the king. The bishop retreats to a quieter square, potentially preparing to redeploy to the kingside or await developments. Seeking to dislodge the troublesome bishop and potentially open lines towards the black king, white offers a check, forcing black to react immediately to the pressure on the f7 square. Consolidating the king's position after the recent exchange of pawns and the bishop's retreat is a sensible defensive maneuver, creating a safer haven shielded from potential diagonal threats. White aims to gently expand on the queenside, preparing to eventually challenge black's piece placement, perhaps with a b4 push, while simultaneously shoring up the pawn structure and providing an escape square for the king should the center ever open up aggressively. Black redirects the knight from its potentially vulnerable outpost on d7 to a more active square on e7, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially supporting a kingside pawn storm with f5. A clever regrouping, shuffling the bishop to a more active diagonal to eye black's d6 pawn and potentially support a d5 advance, while also freeing up the knight for a more central role. Solidifying the pawn structure on the queenside is the immediate intention, creating a firm base for potential queenside expansion or simply preventing white from gaining further pawn leverage in that sector, while also preparing to challenge white's bishop on b3. A strategic redeployment, the bishop abandons its advanced outpost to seek a more secure square, indirectly reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn breaks. The knight decisively strides into the heart of white's camp, immediately challenging the bishop and casting doubt on its previous outpost. This bold deployment aims to disrupt white's harmonious pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, seizing initiative by creating immediate, tangible threats rather than passively waiting. Securing the queenside pawn structure is the immediate goal here, preventing black's potential b5 expansion and solidifying white's spatial advantage in that sector. Instigating a bold initiative, black redirects their knight towards the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure and potentially launch an assault on the king's flank. Clearing out the outpost, this capture directly challenges the central structure and aims to disrupt black's pawn chain by removing a key attacking piece from that powerful square. Opening the queenside file with this pawn thrust fundamentally alters the positional landscape, creating immediate tension and demanding a strategic response from white. The queen's deployment to b3 immediately targets the weak pawn on b4 and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside, potentially creating weaknesses for future pressure. That bishop repositions itself to a far more active diagonal, eyeing potential threats along the queenside and challenging white's seemingly secure queenside pawn structure by directly attacking white's doubled pawns. Strategically repositioning the rook to potentially control the e-file or support a pawn push, while also freeing the bishop on a4 to find a more active square, signals a shift towards central dominance, albeit with a slight concession of space on the queenside that may need addressing later. Unleashing the knight's potential on the kingside, this redeployment seeks to activate its latent attacking power and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Liberating the bishop from its cramped diagonal to gain influence over the a5 square. Relocating the bishop to g8 relinquishes valuable diagonal influence and central control, seemingly passive, but perhaps aiming to reinforce the kingside or prepare for a later g-pawn push. A subtle repositioning, this queen exchange aims to simplify the position, potentially leading to a favorable endgame by clearing the queenside. The knight's daring dash to h4 immediately introduces a complex web of tactical possibilities, challenging white's control of the kingside and hinting at a potential invasion of the vulnerable f3 square. The exchange on h4 seizes the initiative to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure and potentially open lines around their king. Suddenly, the queen emerges from her gilded cage, a potent weapon now unleashed, aiming directly at the weakened kingside pawn structure. Initiating a pawn push on the queenside aims to disrupt black's bishop's influence and potentially create outposts, but it neglects the immediate threat of black's active queen and knight, leaving the kingside vulnerable to further penetration. The bishop, having returned to the familiar b6 square, now eyes the critical a5 diagonal, potentially setting up threats against white's queenside pawns and seeking to liberate itself from its slightly passive placement behind the d6 pawn. This repositioning of the rook to the third rank seeks to leverage potential pressure along the e-file, but it sacrifices valuable time and allows black to consolidate their pieces, particularly the knight now eyeing the weakened kingside. Consider how this rook's new station truly contributes to a concrete attacking plan versus merely occupying a square that could be used to develop other pieces or support pawn advances elsewhere on the board. The bishop on g8 is a curious target, but can it be effectively pressured with this rook placement? Harnessing the centralized bishop on b6, black aims to provoke pawn weaknesses on white's queenside, potentially opening lines for further piece activity. Clearing the path on the g-file for an assault, this aggressive advance signals a serious intention to disrupt black's defenses and potentially open lines towards the king. The rook's repositioning aims to activate along the open kingside file, potentially pressuring white's weakened pawn structure, though it might leave the queenside temporarily less defended. Unleashing a bishop to g6 instantly aims to disrupt black's well-established queenside structure and create attacking possibilities around the now exposed king. Repositioning the bishop allows for a more active role, aiming to exploit the open lines that white's pieces have recently created and challenging the control of the central squares. Opening the path for the knight to a more active square near the enemy king creates immediate tactical potential. Snatching that pawn feels tempting, but it opens up a hornet's nest of threats around your king, leaving it exposed and vulnerable to a swift tactical onslaught. The exchange of queens opens a new chapter, focusing on the battle for central squares and the potential for an endgame. White's pieces now find themselves a bit disorganized, particularly the knight on e4, which lacks immediate support, while black's rook on a5 has gained a rather active post. This offers black an opportunity to regroup and exploit white's slightly awkward development. Unleashing the dark-squared bishop from its passive post, this maneuver seeks to reactivate the piece and disrupt white's previously established queenside control. The immediate aim appears to be creating counterplay along the third rank, or perhaps preparing for a future pawn push like c5, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's pawn structure after the capture. Finally, the rook returns to the central file, aiming to contest the open d-file and potentially infiltrate black's territory, a crucial step in navigating this complex middle game and preparing for a potential endgame transition where file control often dictates success. Baffling choice, deliberately surrendering the pawn for what appears to be a fleeting attempt to complicate matters. The rook's repositioning to the third rank initiates a strategic pivot, aiming to bolster potential threats on the king side or establish dominance over the g-file should it open further, while simultaneously offering a defensive retreat if black's pieces become too aggressive in the center. Reactivating the bishop by stepping back to the open diagonal offers a fresh attacking avenue, potentially targeting the weakened kingside squares should the opportunity arise. Re-establishing pressure on the f-file, the rook pivots, aiming to exploit any weakness that might arise as the queens are off the board and the endgame beckons. Reclaiming the outpost on d5, black aims to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop, hinting at a potential kingside attack, or at least creating more forcing lines. Opening up the g-file could be a double-edged sword, creating potential attack vectors, but simultaneously weakening your own kingside pawn structure for later incursions. Seizing the open file here presents a bold challenge, aiming to disrupt white's central structure and perhaps create threats down the file, though it leaves your king somewhat exposed in the process. A bold gambit to reclaim initiative, this move sacrifices a pawn to disrupt black's consolidated position and unlock the f-file, aiming to generate immediate threats against the black king. The rook reclaims the open file, a bold assertion aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay along the first rank. Reclaiming the open file is paramount to reactivating white's pieces and preparing for a potential counterplay on the queen side. The exchange of rooks simplifies the board, a logical step with queens off, aiming to exploit the open d-file and the potential weaknesses around white's king in what becomes a more tactical endgame. Restoring the rook to the central file after the exchange offers a fresh perspective, aiming to exploit the queenside pawn structure black has meticulously built, which now presents potential weaknesses after white's earlier pawn sacrifices. The bishop retreats to c3, a seemingly passive repositioning, yet it subtly contests the open c-file and prepares to eye the advanced passed pawn on a4 if white decides to push it further. Unleashing the knight from its temporary outpost, white aims to disrupt black's recently organized pieces, particularly targeting the bishop on c3 and potentially opening lines towards the kingside where black's king is still somewhat exposed. This aggressive thrust seeks to exploit the potential overextension of black's pawns on the queen side and seize the initiative. The rook now eyes the undefended pawn on f6, a tempting target that will force a difficult decision, likely involving piece repositioning or even sacrificing material to avoid a cascading disaster.